why do you imagine that? Why do you imagine that status? So in your article, you say that the status game is one in which you can't really discuss your desire or need for status.
Yeah.
Is that true?
It's not true in all contexts. I wrote a column about it, so obviously I can discuss it, and I'm discussing it with you right now. But there's this there would be something wrong. Like, I had this interaction with somebody who I felt was asking me to acknowledge their status recently. And I had this instinct to say, I would like to acknowledge your status. You're more important than me. Now can we just go on? And I couldn't do that. That wasn't allowed. I knew that was not allowed within the game. That would have been offensive, right? So it's a rule of the game that you have to pretend that you're not playing it. But you can then sort of like take a step back, right? And then be like, oh, let's analyze. You can always do that. And I'm sorry, you can't always do it, but you can sometimes do it. But that's not this. That's almost like putting the game on pause and then stepping back and analyzing what was happening.
So in other words, you have the game in a debugger and you're stepping through lines of the code in a different facility than that which is actually running the code.
Yes.
Okay. So if that's the case, why is it?
Sorry, can I interrupt you? There's no guarantee that you won't then be reprising the game at the second level.
Well, so that's the issue, which is that each layer of analysis that you put on it becomes non-meta relative to the following level of meta-analysis that includes that layer. And then you have a question of convergence, in essence, where you have an initial game, then you have a meta game. So your article was ostensibly in the second level of that game. But then effectively what you did was you communicated to me whatever status game you and I negotiated in your office. Right. I have a different status game, which is that I have access to a learned journal in which I can write articles. I thought you important enough to write an article in part inspired by our meeting. And then I'm communicating that I too, have levers that may not be available to you. And I wish to let you know that you are both important enough to warrant this thinking. Simultaneously, don't think that you got away with something because in fact, I can see things.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's right. So I think what that reveals is I've noticed you use in a couple of your podcasts this word metacognitive. And I think that I'm much more of a skeptic about how much work the meta can do, at least immediately, for exactly this reason. I think that like when you step back, it doesn't matter what you're stepping back from. Okay, like you're in a situation, you're like, let me step back and think about this, or let me step back and cool my, from my emotions. Let me step back. You're never stepping back. You're always just the same person you were. It's an illusion to think you can step back. But I think what does happen when you step back is like stepping back happens at least a moment later than what was happening.
I don't think so in some sense, because really the way I see it, I'm eager to hear if I'm wrong in your eyes, is that what we just did is we had a zeroth layer, which is our initial meeting. Then we had the issue where you wished to notify me that you had written an article partially inspired by this. And then I wish to bring this up on the podcast, which is the next layer.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about the fact that and my point in doing this is that we build an infinite tower of analyses of the previous level analysis. So meta is not a different facility, but simply the recognition that layer I+1 is commenting on layer I.
Right. But the thing the metaphor of the tower, the problem with it is that it's synchronic. And so I think that I've changed between our initial meeting and writing that article. It wasn't like I just sat down and wrote it. I had to think really hard about that meeting. I had an initial version that was totally scrapped. I learned in between our meeting and writing that article. And I've even learned in between, talking about it with you and now. Right. So I'm like a different person. You're talking to a different person than you were talking to when we first met.
In one sense. In
one sense, yes. In the sense that it's not a tower. Like I've sort of incorporated some of the lessons from that interaction. And I think one thing is like, it's a little bit like, I remember there were these, when my son's preschool, when he first started, there were these charts that were like diagrams of how kids move around a room in like so he's like 2 or 3 years old, right? Like, so it was like this line, like first they go to the sandbox, then they go to the blocks, and right? So what was amazing is you look at the lines for like a 3-year-old, and it's like just this like scribble scrabble, they randomly wander around, and then then they had these diagrams for like the 5, not even, no, I think it would be like a couple months later, towards the end of the year, of the same, so they're the same age, but they're like a little bit older, and they're like much more organized, right? So I see that as happening with conversation with you, where part of what's happening is like learning to focus.
Right.
And that's not really well captured, I think, with the idea of a meta level.
Not sure that I understood that.
Well,
So can we talk a little bit about the particular status game and our subsequent interpretations of what it meant? Okay. So it was very interesting when I was just talking to you before the show. You talked to me about saying, I'm not even sure that status is exactly the right word for what we were negotiating. And that was an intuition where it hadn't grounded yet in language. It's in some sort of more primitive kind of intangible state. And I had forgotten exactly what the issue was, but that you'd known very little about me. I think Tyler Cowen had maybe alerted you to me.
Yes.
And that wasn't particularly surprising to me. I don't expect people to know who I am. But what little you did know about me was that somehow I was part of a money machine as a managing director of a family office, and that was going to be kind of the expansion point, that was going to be like the 0th approximation, and then we'd add first and second and third order approximations based on that expansion point. Right. Which drove me nuts. Right. Because that would never be the expansion point that I would choose for myself, nor do I think it is the correct one. And then we had some interesting other issues, which is that I've heard a great deal about you, more than I've read of your thinking and work. And many people that I like regard you highly. And I thought, okay, well, this is likely to be a singular person, and it would be a shame to lose a singular person based on a wrong expansion point in a conversation. So there was sort of an emergency need to rebase the conception of the other around a more fruitful point so as not to lose a potentially interesting interaction. And then when I communicated this to you, you and I both share an aversion to talking about the world of exceptional people, which often the members of the world of exceptional people constantly regard themselves and the other as exceptional in a kind of self-congratulatory display. So the whole thing kind of descends into an orgy of analysis on analysis on analysis. And I wonder why we're not just more capable of doing this more simply, like, hey, I'm worried you're forming an incorrect impression of me, or I need some acknowledgement from you that there is an issue of accomplishment, or, so that you don't start lecturing me about basic mathematics if I'm a mathematician, let's say.
Right. So, first of all, I actually do think this is probably a sort of a difference between us, in that, suppose that I thought you knew me as just all that you knew about me was that I was a mother or something. Okay. I'm not sure. I guess what I thought you knew about me was that I was like an academic or something. And I'm not sure that would have mattered to me, like which of those you had picked. But in terms of why we can't just directly ask for this, I think we could have if we were teenagers or something. But I think we learned not to do it. We learned how to interact with people. Right. And that's a rule. And so we're both following the rule.
Somewhat. I mean, I think that there's also this problem. Maybe I'll pose it to you. Why truth doesn't work. I'm not a huge fan of truth the way some people are. And I'm
a huge fan of truth.
That's beautiful. So I posed them the problem of, if I have only mildly bad breath and you wish to let me know that for my own benefit, what's a way in which you could communicate to me that I have mildly bad breath? And I've actually never met anyone who's solved this puzzle. So you should try the 0th order first, and we'll see why it gets into trouble.
Right. So that would just be saying you have mildly bad breath.
Right. Now, because of the context of that, the interpretation of that statement is, my God, is such a taboo to talk about someone's breath
It must be horrible.
that it must be horrible for you to say that it is mild. And so what you've done is you've communicated an untruth even though you intended. So then you start thinking about the problem of like your eyeball is distorted, so you need a second distortion in this case your spectacles, so that the aggregate of the two is undistorted.
Can I give my answer?
Yeah, please.
I think
You're the philosopher. It's going to be awesome.
I think I would be like, oh my God, I can't believe this is actually happening, because this one time I talked to Eric Weinstein and he posed this as a problem. What do you do? What do you tell someone when they have mildly bad breath? And now I'm in that situation. That's what I would say to the person.
Do you think it gets read that way?
I have no idea. I mean, I'm giving you an answer in the abstract, abstracting from the person.
Right, but I'm trying to make the point that
my point is that would be a cool way that, like, I would say that just because I would be curious with how the person's going to respond. So, like, there's a question: how do you do this? What's a successful interaction?
Right.
For me, that's a promising response because it might generate an interesting conversation.
Well, it will generate an interesting conversation. The issue, though, is, to my way of thinking, that you have to give up on truthful communication because of its impossibility in order to start seeing what is possible, where truth is a component and an interest, but it can't be a goal. In other words, if I say, what is the fractional representation of pi, it doesn't mean you can't come close, but you're never going to get there with two integers dividing one by the other. So my claim is that it's very important to give up on the possibility of truth from the get-go.
So that doesn't seem right to me. So, I mean, one thing is, it may be that I cannot immediately communicate to you the truth. I think,
but as I learn you, then I will realize that you speak in an undistorted fashion. You believe?
No, I think that one thing that happens is that people they learn like a new shared language, like they learn how to communicate with one another, right? And they become better at doing that. And it may be that it seems to me that the goal of that process is always to communicate better and more truthfully, though it's also, I think, really important to distinguish which truths are important and are unimportant to communicate or less important to communicate, because you have to focus somewhere too, right? But I think that the only goals you can have in modulating that process, the only possible goal is being able not just to communicate, but to learn truths from that person. That's the fueling the whole process. Otherwise, what would you be in it for?
Well, the four things that I try to reduce my objectives to, and this is subject to change. In fact, you somewhat frighten me. Maybe I will have to change it based on what you're about to say next. Are truth, meaning, fitness, and grace. So something can be truthful, but it can lead to a reduction in my fitness as a creature. So a self-extinguishing truth is not an interesting truth to me. Jordan Peterson tried to fold fitness into truth itself, and he got into trouble with Sam Harris, who was having none of it. Then there's a question of meaning. Maybe something is true and it means that I will be fit, but it actually robs my life of meaning. When somebody I care about deeply is regarded as an aggregate of hadrons and leptons and force particles, that may be true, but it completely robs that person of meaning. If I realize that, with 26 letters, let's say, and a few spaces, I can take, let's say, an alphabet of, 40 characters or less and raise it to a very high power and say that Hamlet is somewhere found within. That may be truthful. Maybe that there are a finite number of works possible and Shakespeare merely selected one from a giant lookup table. But that tends to rob the work of any majesty and meaning. And then there's an aspect of grace, which is that even if I can find meaning and fitness and truth together, if the solution is brutal and cruel and lacks some sort of ineffable quality of mercy and kind of, simplicity of heart, I tend to turn against those things where one has to do something absolutely despicable, for example, to perpetuate one's group's fitness. So I don't know how to get beyond those four those four subcomponents of an objective function. And what I'm always astounded by is people who are crazy about truth.
Yeah, good. So maybe can I defend being crazy about truth? Okay.
The floor is yours.
So first of all, like, I think anytime you divide things, and like philosophers disagree about this, like some philosophers are fine with the sort of thing I'm about to describe, but like, I think you can't just divide things into four things. You're like, here are the four things. These are the things I found. I'm like, well, what's the principle of division? Like, is that just something you made up? Like, what if we come up with a fifth one? So I want to understand.
I'm totally amenable to it.
I want to understand sort of how the whole is articulated into those things. Until I understand that, I just don't feel like I've understood anything. Like, why not? Okay, why not pleasure? Why isn't pleasure one of them? Enjoyment.
Well, in part, that is part of meaning, and it's also part of grace, as long as the proximate of pleasure. See, pleasure arises in my concept as proximate to fitness. So the way in which that we're structured as animals is that our ultimate concerns, like nutrition and consolidation of long-term memory, are encoded as hunger and sleepiness. And the proximates cause us to take actions to service the ultimates. So pleasure is in some sense the divorcing of the proximates from their ultimate goals. I just ate a cupcake, and I really shouldn't have. But the proximate pleasure, because my body thinks that I'm starved for sugar when in our current environment it's abundant. So I'm always...
You just gave an argument that suggested that pleasure does not fit into fitness because the proximate
pleasure can be divorced from its ultimate goals.
Right. So at least some people might think that would warrant putting pleasure into a separate category.
But I don't want it.
Right. But what I'm saying is the fact that you don't want to, that indicates that for some reason you're wedded to this quadripartite division which is not.
Did you just say quadripartite?
Yes.
I've never said that.
But so let me tell you how I would divide things.
Okay.
Okay. So I would start with thinking. Okay. There's thinking, right? Anytime and I think conversation is a form of thinking. In fact, a lot of times it's the best form of thinking. And I think that any thinking has to have a goal. Well, there's an exception, but okay. The main case, thinking has to have a goal. And I think there are two goals that thinking can have. One of them is understanding. Okay, where truth is a necessary condition. It has to arrive at the truth in order to be understanding. It's not sufficient because there are just truths that are not important to know. And so a lot of thinking that we do will end when you've understood whatever it was you're trying to understand. You're like, I got it. There, we're done. And some forms of thinking are wonderful, like a lot of mathematical forms of thinking are wonderful precisely because it's really clear when you've gotten to that point and you have this like aha moment. Plato actually described that as almost like you're remembering something you knew before because it has that recognition like memory. Okay, that's understanding. Then there's another kind of thinking, and I think of it as very different. And you are right that some people want to collapse these two, and I don't think they should be collapsed, which is thinking that aims at the good in some way. And that's deliberation. So it's reasoning about how to achieve some good. And I also think we often do that with other people, right? And so we might want to bring something about, and we think about how to do that, okay? I think those are the basic aims of thinking, either understanding or some good that we're trying to bring about. And I don't think they're the same. And some people, like especially like some like economists, I think, are especially prone to collapsing them. You know, Marx's idea, the point of philosophers have tried to understand the world. The point is to change it. It's amazing because the Humboldt, the philosophy department in Germany in the Humboldt University actually has that as their slogan. And I was like, guys, you are philosophers. How can that be your slogan? You're not trying to do this. You're the one people who should not have this as your slogan. But in any case, that idea that Marx, but not just Marx, is trying to collapse the theoretical and the practical. The idea that understanding is a goal, and it's like the only reason you would ever have to understand is that you want to achieve some good. That's a way to collapse the two. So I don't think they should be collapsed. I think they're separate. But that's the basic division. I actually think we do some thinking that doesn't fall into this division. That's very, very interesting. I think some of the kind of emotional upheaval in our life doesn't fall into this division. But for me, see, that's a principled division, right? And truth has a part in it. Now, I think a lot of the things you're worried about with meaning, like, are there these truths that rob my life of meaning? What I would say is that those are situations in which you have accepted a descriptive analysis as a reductive one. So like, it's true that I'm made of atoms. Okay. That's true. I think it's true. But that doesn't tell you who I really am. It's a truth about me, but it's not a good answer to a certain question. And so you shouldn't confuse the idea that something is a true proposition with the idea that it's a good answer to a question. In a sense, the question, who am I really, is like the question you were seeking an answer to when we first met. And if I had said, oh, I'm a bunch of atoms, like that wouldn't have satisfied you. It wouldn't have been an answer to your question. So I would fold the meaning into understanding, with the proviso that you have to hold on tight to your question and make sure that what someone has said in answer to it isn't just a true statement, but actually an answer to the question.
Well, to my way of thinking, I would not say it's a category error that questions, or as physicists would call them, observables, are tied to a strata, and that there are certain questions that are badly suited to a particular strata. So your description as atoms and your description as Agnes correspond to two different, let's say, effective theories, which is sort of the tower of lies, where there are more lies when I call you Agnes than when I specify each of the atoms in your body. But the point is that the question about what is Agnes like is not really a question at the atomic layer. It's a question at this personality layer so in fact, it is a kind of category error to explore. Meaning doesn't belong at the atomic layer. There is no atomic meaning.
Right, exactly. But that's why I think that you don't need a separate meaning box. You just need to keep track of your questions.
Well, that would be just the way polar versus rectangular coordinates are two different ways of talking about something. I think you could make that point.